probably about time to kick off. So, as I said, thank you very much for your time and very much appreciate your interest in this. So today we're going to be talking around the autonomous business continuity. So this is a portfolio of offerings that Ultima have around enabling businesses to kind of continue through the very unique and challenging times that we're facing. So it's very much focused around what we're calling the 2020 way of working. So I'm Matthew Beale, so I'm pre-sales architect for Ultima Labs. So all of these various offerings are things that Ultima Labs and Ultima have come up with, both through development of our own IP, as well as using third-party tools and technologies that we have access to in order to help our customers and our clients out there kind of get through this very challenging time. As we all kind of are aware, there's been a bit of an impact over the last year, and we'll kind of dive into that to begin with. But first off, I thought we'd go through an agenda. So as I said, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at what 2020 has done. 2020 has definitely been a bit of a step change since 2019. We'll kind of look at some of those differences. And then we're going to go into the three different areas that we're going to be looking at as part of this. This is going to be the first of a series of webinars. So there is going to be another one on autonomous disaster recovery in more detail, another one on autonomous remote working in more detail, and another one on autonomous migrate in more detail. This is just going to be a high level to kind of introduce those topics, give you a bit of an idea, because there may be one that you're more interested in, maybe one that you're less interested in, and therefore you can kind of pick if there's one that you want to go into further deep dive with, or maybe share with your wider teams, that there may be some kind of interest as part of that. So to begin with, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the impact of 2020. If we look back over kind of towards last year, the kind of issues that businesses were facing and businesses were trying to address were very much around the kind of the productivity place, mobile working, where people were trying to work on the move. So we quite often saw people, especially people who are out on the road, it was much more of how can they get back to corporate resources without having to be physically tied to a more traditional kind of desktop style way of working? Can they use mobile devices and that kind of thing? As part of this, it's looking to kind of improve that work-life balance is what we were trying to do last year. Whilst there is also the flip side of compliance. Compliance was a huge thing last year. And to be fair, it still remains an issue now. How do you impose the security policy and the security posture that you require as a business whilst your users are not necessarily within the defines of a traditional corporate office? And the other one was cost reduction. Cost reduction was something that, and it's always the case for businesses and IT departments, of how can they help reduce and manage those costs kind of going forward. But it was looked as more of an overall cost. A lot of it was still CapEx spent last year. And as we move towards this year, what we're looking at as the kind of big problems are home working. It's not the traditional mobile working as such. There is more of how do you have these, pretty much everyone in the company, and there are obviously certain industries that are more or less affected by this, but how do you enable kind of home working? How do you enable low touch management? Because it's not the case today that you can go around to every single user's location and actually address those IT issues, especially if you've got a large amount of people home working. So how does that happen from an end user perspective? If you've got a traditional data center deployment, you can't necessarily go into that office. You're not necessarily there. How do you manage that without having to touch it as such? How would you kind of augment your platform and actually allow it to scale as it needs to? That kind of leads into that increased flexibility. The way we're trying to work now is a much more flexible kind of mechanism of working. We need stuff to be able to be spun up and spun down pretty quickly, especially when we're talking end user stuff in terms of the kind of application sets they have, but even things like VPN connectivity, application scaling. What happens when suddenly these applications, which haven't traditionally been used because they're just used for people who are remote accessing before, suddenly they need much more compute and power than they used to? That is becoming a real challenge today. Availability is also a problem. And this isn't necessarily a problem as of yet, but it's something that we're starting to see businesses really, really consider, is how do they make sure that the stuff is available when there isn't a person there to feed and water it in the traditional sense? And then the last one, which is becoming really big, especially depending on where and what business sector you're in, is cash flow. It's not necessarily, we're moving away, and very quickly actually, from a capital-based expenditure model into an operational-based expenditure model. It's how can we not have a big 100, 200, 300,000 pound cost right now, because that's something the business right now can't stomach or afford? Can we go and move that into an operational cost? Is there a mechanism to do that? How easily can we do that? So we can help manage that cash flow through the business to allow for obviously things like payment of wages, etc., that need to still be done. And that is one of the big aspects, big changes we've seen, is that kind of cash flow enablement, which has become very, very important. So as we can see, they are in many ways similar issues, just done in a different sense, but they are also fundamentally different in some ways. What we're trying to get at is much more of fully distributed enterprises now, rather than a subsection of people being out and about. This is now everyone. And how do we then make this cost effective going forwards? So the first area that we want to look at is autonomous DR. So this is the ability to provide DR capabilities within 3 hours. And this is the kind of the setup for having a DR environment. One of the things that is becoming more important, and especially as we're realizing what this whole state in 2020 is actually starting to unravel to, and I'm trying not to mention the C word, which I think we all know. What we're starting to see is, okay, how can we go and provide disaster recovery to our business? This isn't necessary to say this is a full business continuity plan or anything like that. We're not trying to do BCP planning here. What we're trying to do is enable your business to keep running as effectively as possible without a huge amount of manual overhead and effort as part of it. Because what we want to do is move towards a more autonomous or automated setup. So autonomous DR is built for effectively 3 kind of scenarios. There are a couple of very clever and interesting ways that you can use this as well, that I'll kind of touch on as part of this. But these are the 3 kind of main things we're looking at. Is a low touch disaster recovery. We are moving to a world where you can't have 5, 6, 7, 8 people turn up at a data center because you need to do DR, plug in keyboards, mice, screens, all that kind of stuff, and start tapping away. That is no longer really a mechanism that we can use as of today. It needs to be something that is pretty low touch. You need to be able to do it remotely. To give you an example, Equinix fairly recently basically stopped any third-party access into their data centers. So if your DR is in Equinix and you physically need someone to go there, you are in a bit of a problem. Yes, they have their smart hand services. How booked up they are, probably another question. So for that example, you need something that you don't have to go and physically be touching the kit in order to be able to do. Another thing that we're trying to look towards is, how do we make this cost effective? The traditional DR setup has been to go and take effectively a copy of production. We will put it physically in another place. So this would be, if you're an on-premise scenario, this be all the hosts, all the SAN switching, all the networking that goes with that, and then move it physically, well, have another copy in a secondary place, and then have a mechanism to fail over, whether that be using backup software like Veeam, or it might be using VMware SRM, whatever mechanism it would be, that was the mechanism to do it. And I'm not saying that is necessarily a wrong mechanism to do it, but certainly for smaller businesses, it can become a very cost inefficient way of doing it. If you are a very large business and you've got a load of test and dev that you can run on that equipment, actually sometimes you can make it work cost effectively. But if you're a smaller business that doesn't have huge amounts of test and dev and UAT and all these kind of different scenarios that you're running through, effectively you have a large capital outlay, or if you're leasing it, an operational outlay that you're not necessarily getting any value from. So as part of this, what we're trying to do is, how can we allow you to reduce that operational capital expenditure and then utilize that more effectively somewhere else? And the last one is remote disaster recovery. This I kind of touched on as part of the low touch piece, but we're moving to a world where everything needs to be remotely managed. You can't have humans physically going and doing things anymore. And And also, and this is actually quite an interesting kind of problem that a few people have come up against, is that we have firms where their DR and business continuity was to move physically to another building, which is fine if there is a problem with one building, but given the current state of the world and the restrictions that have been put down, that doesn't necessarily solve the problem of the fact that you can't access either of the buildings. So it's led to some interesting kind of conversations, especially as we go up towards kind of board levels and things like that, of how do we actually manage this going forwards? So that's kind of where we're trying to go with this, and the kind of solution, the design of the solution and what we're trying to address. So let's first step back and look at actually what the problem is. So the first thing is IT is critical to businesses. There are very few businesses today that can run without IT at all. I'm not going to band around the big percentages that are normally banded around. They're not difficult to go and find if you want to go and find them. But there is a statement that having no DR, and if a problem happens, will cause a significant, if not irreparable, damage to that business. And that at the end of the day can cause a failure for their business. And given the trying times that we're in, that's not necessarily something that businesses are capable of coping with as of right now. The second kind of problem statement with DR is actually a very complex thing to go and build. It is generally a large consultancy effort in order to be able to do it. So it may be a third party, it may be ultimately, maybe someone else that you bring in order to be able to help you build that DR design and that build out of that platform and environment. And that generally can be a fairly costly exercise because you've got to set up all the runbooks, etc. You've got to actually do a full mapping exercise of everything that goes into it, how all the networks work, etc. And that can be prohibitive to smaller and medium businesses. The next point, the significant investment, kind of touches back to that cost effectiveness that I was talking about. What we're trying to achieve is to remove the huge hardware investment that needs to be required. Generally, it is 90 to 95, if not 100% of the investment that you'd make in production, you would make in DR. And that's something that, especially at this point, isn't tenable for a lot of businesses. There will be businesses where that DR facility is aging, is probably the nicest way we can put it. And they're looking at how do we go, especially at this point, manage that. One option is obviously do nothing. There are obviously risks associated with that, especially towards the end of life of various pieces of software that sit on it. And then you get into the problem of supporting an unsupported platform. Then if things go wrong, it becomes very challenging to bring it up. And the only time that things are going to go wrong is when DR is invoked and you have the business looking at you to work out what's happening. And the last thing is testing. DR testing is the bane of most people's existence. We have hundreds of customers who spend countless amounts of hours working out how to do DR testing efficiently without impacting production. There is obviously the just go and fail over a weekend and hope everything comes up. That is one method of doing DR testing. Does it impact production in a pretty significant way? Yes. Can you manage that? For sure. But given a lot of businesses, especially now, have compliance, and we don't know exactly how long this whole situation is going to last for. Do you want to be running a DR test with the possibility of things maybe not working exactly as they're meant to and impacting production right now, where you can't necessarily go and fix that issue very quickly because you're not necessarily physically there? These are some real world problems, and we are seeing these out in the wild. And these are problems that aren't necessarily 2020 problems. They have been problems for a while, but there have always been ways around them because we haven't been living in the state and the kind of general kind of climate that we are right now. And they're just becoming more prevalent today because of the lack of physical access to various pieces. So if we look into what the kind of autonomous DR actually gives you, as you can see, the amount of time and effort for actually building out this disaster recovery platform is considerably smaller than what you'd get typically. And we've seen engagements that are 50, if not 100 days to build out a DR platform. And sometimes that can just be as simple as standing up the environment and doing a DR test. It's not full on continual management of it or anything. But typically you're talking at least 8 days for you to do anything of a reasonable level. So this is the design, because for the design you need to be getting all of the kind of mapping in, etc., of what's in the existing environment, what networks are in use, how everything's connected together, what public IPs are in use, if any, all those kind of various things. Whereas when you look into the autonomous DR, we're talking less than 3 hours to do the whole piece. So that is doing kind of an end-to-end DR setup, everything set up, ready to go for you to put stuff in. As part of this, you're going to get a load of stuff. And I haven't listed out everything here. There is a ton more stuff that comes with this. But what we're talking about is a lot of this is kind of the best practice stuff that you'd expect. You also get a nice UI in order to be able to use it. Traditionally, some DR platforms have been a bit of a challenge to work out how the manageability of it works. And we've kind of recognized that. And actually, it's one of the big things about DR is you need to know what's happening, and you need to know when something's broken so you can go and fix it. And this is very much to be used with all of the kind of various other services that exist. So to be completely transparent with everyone, this is utilizing Azure as the backend for it. So it is a cloud scale platform, and it is designed for the redundancy of a cloud-based environment. So it is Azure at the back end. There is a lot of Ultima IP that sits around this in order to be able to build this out for you. A lot of the knowledge that Ultima have of doing this hundreds, if not thousands of times before, of this is what we would do in a DR scenario. This is how we would set it up. That is why we're able to provide this in such a way. So if we then jump into what that kind of solution looks like for our customers. So the first thing is you get a brand new environment. This is where it kind of goes into a bit of a blend in terms of other use cases for it. So you can use it obviously for the DR use case, where you want to fail over either all or part of your environment out into the Azure public cloud, and that is ready to go in less than a day. Obviously the security services, etc. So there's NSGs, etc. set up within the environment, and NSG being a network security group. So think about it similar in many cases to a firewall, and that allows you to have a secure environment. So you're not just going, throw everything up there, throw it into one blanket, effectively kind of like VLAN style thing, and hope for the best. It's actually got separation built into it, so you can actually have a degree of security, and is also auditable as part of that as well. Because a lot of this is building in that security as standard and as part of the build, rather than tacking it on at the end as like an edge security device or something like that. The other thing is it is powered by CSP, so that allows you to have a billing platform, so you can actually go and accurately see what the costs of this are. There is a myriad of other things. This is not a CSP presentation, so I'm not going to jump into all the other things that CSP can give you. But the important aspects to know are it allows you to view what the billing is. It allows you to see where the costs are for various things. So it does give you quite a lot of visibility into your cost management. And obviously, as part of this being a cloud service, this is an operational cost, so it's not a big capital upfront investment. The last thing is obviously this allows you to replicate your virtual machines into Azure, and it allows you to do online testing of your environment without impacting production. So you can still have your on-prem physical environment with the virtual machines sat on top of it. You can then do a DR test in Azure without impacting that on-prem working environment. So this can, in theory, be done. I'm not necessarily 100% suggesting this, but if you wish to, you can do it during the day while everyone's working and actually have this testing and ready to go. So you don't need to be doing DR tests over weekends and all that kind of fun stuff that we've had to do in the past. So hopefully that gives you a brief rundown of what the autonomous DR aspect is. It gives you a bit of kind of knowledge at high level of what that is. As I said, there is going to be a future webinar that's going to go into that in a load more detail. You will see some of those slides in slightly more detailed format as part of this going forwards. So if that is something of interest, I would highly recommend that you sign up to that, and that will allow you to kind of go further into that as part of it. So the next thing we're going to be jumping into is the autonomous remote working. So this is enabling you to have a remote workforce, so a home-enabled workforce in under 2 days in a very secure environment. So there's a few scenarios that we're designing the autonomous workforce remote working solution for. There is obviously the secure remote access. So this is one of the really big things, and this is actually a problem that Ultima had. Is we were not necessarily 100% ready for this, for the situation that we're currently put in. But being an IT company and a services company that we are, we have been able to build out a solution for ourselves in order to enable all this. So right now we are a fully 100% home working company. But as part of this, we've been able to build in a standardization in order to help our customers get to exactly the same point. So it allows a much better protection for staff, first off, but also allows better protection for IT as well, because this is using proper secure remote access. So nothing kind of slightly more open, having to expose RDP ports and all that kind of stuff out to the internet. That's not a great idea. Would not recommend doing that. The solution also allows for scalable remote working as well. So it's not just how do you go and do kind of a one-to-one relationship, it's how do you go and build that out in a more scalable manner. And also it enables your kind of more migration of data centers out to cloud. So if you're using, let's say, the DR piece or the migrate piece that we'll get into in a little bit, it allows you to more effectively kind of leverage that going forwards. Most important thing is we're not trying to use a VPN here. All of these solutions that we try and talk about are trying to move away from using VPN-based access, because VPN-based access, whilst it served a purpose in the past, is not necessarily the most reliable, and especially when we're scaling to the levels that we are now, it's not necessarily designed in order to be able to cope with what we're trying to do today. So kind of touching on that limited VPN piece, VPNs have been, as I said, they've had uses in the past. They're not necessarily the way that we always want to do things. We want to try and generally do stuff in a slightly more smart and intelligent way. Part of this is there is a bit of a security risk when you're using a VPN, especially to another network that you don't necessarily control a lot of the traffic on, is how do you go and make sure that nothing is getting into your network or nothing is jumping across various devices into your network through the VPN. So that is a security risk. There's also generally a problem of there's a limited number of connections for VPNs and also the reliability of it. I'm sure all of you have excellent, fully reliable VPNs, but if not, this can be a way around that. And it is something that is becoming more of a problem as we kind of move forward. The second problem is legacy applications. If you are a fully web-based application shop, actually it's not too much of a problem, the whole home working piece. However, there are very few customers that are fully web-based. There are no kind of internal-based applications. So as such, you need to generally be on a corporate network in order to access those legacy applications. They don't have an external web interface for them. So as such, that's where you kind of fall back, default to VPNs, because then VPNs put you on that local network and then you can go and access stuff, which is great. But as we kind of discussed, that doesn't necessarily allow for the proper security posture that you may want, and it's not necessarily fully reliable, and the performance can be impacted, and then you get users complaining and raising support tickets and all those kind of things. Then if you're going to go for the full kind of remote access kind of setup, then actually that is generally quite a complex thing to set up. If you look at like Citrix deployments or Horizon View deployments, they can often be months, if not sometimes years, in order to be able to get them right. And what we're trying to do here is move away from that very heavily kind of professional services engagement and actually move into what we're deeming as two different offerings that are going to be there to cater for small to medium businesses that need to get remote access into their environment. So the two offerings are a basic offering and an advanced offering. So the basic offering is more simply, is kind of closer to an RDP style of environment, where the user will have their device, whether that be a desktop, whether that be a laptop, whatever it may be, physically in the office on that network, and then they're allowed to log in securely, not via a VPN, and be able to use that device as if they were physically sat in front of it. So that's quite a kind of a quick way to get online. So that allows you to get online within 2 days. We've been able to standardize a deployment for that. And then the second one is the more advanced way of doing it. So this is a scalable and resilient platform for remote users. So this is going towards the kind of remote desktop, the virtual desktop deployment mechanism. But we can get users online within 5 days for that. So within a working week, you'll have users online, obviously depending on size, scale, and all those kind of things. And then you can actually start immediately doing full kind of resilient remote desktop deployment. So to give you a bit of a better idea, I thought it was probably worth kind of providing a diagram, allowing you to actually kind of look through this and actually see what it looks like. So in this scenario, we've got our main office and a secondary office. Just as examples, there's 3 machines in the main office, 1 in the secondary. It could be 10 and 3, it doesn't matter the number. And there is kind of a WAN connectivity between the two. So this may be like an MPLS or something like that. It may be a VPN between the two, so like a point-to-point connection or something like that. But there is some form of connectivity between the two as a stretch network, basically. As such, basically, there are some deployment to Citrix connectors which are put in the main office. They're then connected up to the Citrix cloud. As part of this, then remote users go in via Citrix and allows them to get directly to their device. So this is not using VPNs. This is using basically web-based traffic. So we're not trying to do anything funky here. We're not trying to go and tell users to go and configure VPNs or anything like that remotely. We're trying to keep this as simple as possible to give them remote access to their machine. So they'll get it in the exact state that obviously they know and love it to be when you're talking about it kind of from the traditional work deployment. If we go into the advanced setup, so this is generally for maybe a slightly larger business than that, where that isn't going to be a scalable mechanism to work, or you're concerned that someone may go and accidentally turn off the power or something like that as part of the office, whatever it may be. If you want to go to something slightly more scalable, you'd have a data center. What we would do is then we would connect that up to an Azure tenant. So that might be via point-to-point VPN or an express route, depending on obviously your scale and if you've got one. Then as part of this, this is where we would actually be deploying effectively the virtual desktop workforce for that. So as part of this, we'd have those virtual workers, virtual desktops sat in the Azure tenant. That'd be then connected out to Citrix Cloud, which is where all the connections are directed from. And then this would allow everything in the Azure tenant to access the applications that sat in the data center. And as part of this, users will connect in via the Citrix Cloud, then straight to their virtual desktop, and then be able to access exactly as you normally expect. So this, generally, as was kind of detailed earlier on, slightly more of an engagement. We're typically talking about 5 days for this to begin with, and obviously that scales up. If you're talking thousands and thousands of users, obviously you can imagine it's going to take a few more than 5 days. But for a lot of deployments, we're talking around kind of the 5-day mark for this. So that gives you an idea of what that kind of remote working piece is. As I said, this is going to be gone into in a load more detail over the next kind of series of webinars. So if this is something that specifically you want to look into, as I said, there is going to be a session based on this in a lot more detail where we're going to go through a lot more of this in terms of some of the specifics around some of the connection types, what is supported, what isn't supported, all that kind of good stuff. But this is just to give you a high level overview, because I don't want to bore you to tears with everything if this isn't something that you're going to be massively interested in. And the last thing is the autonomous migrate piece. So this is allowing a migration of virtual machines to the cloud in a risk-free manner. So this is allowing you to completely move away from the on-premise data center style, and utilizes a lot of the kind of technology and IP that we've been building as part of the Autonomous Cloud. So the three scenarios that we're looking at here is creating a burstable capacity into the cloud, migrating selected workloads into the cloud, and migrating entire data centers. As you can see, this kind of fits in with some of the previous topics that we brought up. So if you look at the autonomous remote working piece, then you may want to go and, if you've, let's say, got some Citrix workloads locally on-prem, but you're running out of capacity, you might want to migrate those out to public cloud, and then also have that burstable capacity out there as well. Similar if you've not got any Citrix, but you want that kind of remote working experience, it is that burstable environment. We're not saying migrate everything. That's the only way you can do it. Actually, it's what do you want to put out there? What are you going to get value from? What do you not have the capacity for today? Because that is the most important thing. Or what do you need to go and create capacity for in the short to medium term? And then if you do want to go kind of the whole hog, move everything out there, obviously that is entirely possible. This is generally more for people who maybe, depending on what your refresh cycle is, they may be coming up to 3 years, they may be coming up to 5 years, 6 years, whatever it may be, in terms of their on-premise platform. And actually, this is not the right time for that on-prem platform to be refreshed. The capital kind of isn't available right now. It's being used for other things within the business. This allows you to move that to an operational model. It's probably something that's going to be more financially efficient for the business as of today. So what we're looking at is how we can do that in an automated way in order to be able to kind of simplify this down and effectively make it as cost effective as possible. So the problems, as you can imagine, these are somewhat similar to the DR ones, just in slightly different ways. So one of the big problems that we've seen, and this is over probably the last 4 to 5 years that we've been doing work out in the public cloud, is actually getting the resource and knowledge is quite a problem. So whether that from a third party, or as we're going to discuss later, whether that's internally, actually getting the expertise of someone to help you to do it isn't massively easy. There aren't a huge amount of partners that exist in the ecosystem that have the knowledge of on-prem as well as the public cloud. It's wonderful that there are quite a few companies out there that have experience in the public cloud. They don't necessarily have the experience of how you move someone out there. They have not felt the pain points of what that on-prem world looks like and some of the issues that may come up as part of it. So they're not really in a position to support you for how you go and do those migrations from the on-prem scenario. The second is very simply the cost of actually designing these things historically has been significant, to be very frank with you, and it requires a lot of technical knowledge in order to be able to build these environments up. The design of a data center out in a public cloud scenario is very intrinsically different to what it is on-prem. On-prem, you manage based on very different points to what you would in a public cloud. Even things like network security groups, that concept doesn't exist particularly on-prem. And you also have very different hardware bounds. You don't have traditional hardware as such. And also, when you move out into the public cloud, it becomes very apparent in terms of the cost metrics of when stuff is over provisioned. So it's how you go and design, build that environment is very important. The third thing is the actual cost of migration. Migration, as simple as it sounds, is actually surprisingly costly a lot of the time. Because a lot of firms typically don't have the skills in-house, they are very reliant on third parties in order to be able to help them, which isn't necessarily a problem. There's no shame in that. I don't think anyone holds any shame to say that sometimes they need some assistance in doing things that they've never done before. But that adds a considerable degree of cost as part of this. Then when we look into how do we actually turn that into kind of BAU support, being able to get the skills internally in order to be able to do this is very challenging. Generally, people who have Azure skill sets do command a higher cost than people who don't have Azure skill sets, depending on obviously what their skills are. And most importantly, they're difficult to find. Finding people who are good at Azure and good at managing Azure is a challenge. And this is one of the challenges that Ultima have in terms of recruiting obviously really good Azure people, is finding them isn't the easiest thing to do. So we are very proud with the people that we've got because they are very capable and very skilled at Azure. So I'm not going to go through everything here because I will bore you to tears, but some of the pieces that I will kind of pick out. So first thing is it's fully documented. Everything that we do and everything that gets done to your environment is fully documented as part of an automated process. So you'll get the proper design documentation that you would expect straight off the bat. So we're not trying, so you're not going to get any kind of cut down documentation or anything. It is pre-designed and pre-built for you. The migration itself is actually built into the kind of service. So we're capable of migrating up to 100 VMs, and it's pre-configured, ready to go as part of this. Then you get into kind of the testing and validation. And these, I promise this is going to be the last bit that I go into. Being able to test that something is migrated successfully is incredibly important. Because it's fine physically moving bits and bytes over there, but if the machine doesn't come back up as expected, then you're into a bit of a problem. And if we can reduce any risk for that, so we're isolating the network so we can actually test it in a similar way to how we were talking about that DR piece, is we can test the machines as they come up without taking down the existing one. So if everything hasn't gone well, we can fail back and then we'll find another way of doing it. So it's kind of built into the logic of this of we're not just going to hope that everything works fine. Actually, there is a lot of logic built into the back end, and this is where kind of Ultima's IP comes in of, okay, let's go and test all these things. These are the checks that we would do to make sure everything's working. Here's the documentation we'd produce. Here's how we would do migrations, and you're getting all of that as part of this service. So going into a little bit more detail in terms of what this service is. So there's, as you can imagine, more than one thing that goes into this service. So what we're looking at here is everything from networking, security, connectivity, policy management, infrastructure, migration services, documentation. The whole lot is done as part of this service. So from setting up even the most basic of networks that are needed to be able to move into it, setting up firewalling and security ruling, all the way through those kind of migration services, any kind of jump box services that you need, all those kind of things are connected and built in as part of this in one go. So we're not trying to go and create any kind of weird kind of set, totally isolated environment that doesn't have any kind of knowledge of anything else that exists in the world. We're trying to build this as something that you can extend to, whether that be for a short period of time because you want to migrate everything out of there, or that's for a longer period of time to allow you to burst into there. That's up to you in terms of how you want to consume it, but that's what we're looking at as part of this. And so to kind of bring this kind of full circle in terms of what this actually looks like, is this is what the on-prem versus cloud kind of element looks like. Is we start building this out, and obviously the on-prem cost, there is a capital cost to begin with, and as you can imagine, over time that goes up a little bit, and then the cloud cost, as you can imagine, increases. The big jump is when we get to the end, is year 6, there is obviously a huge capital cost again. As you can see at the bottom, there is stats that's being put into this. So there is actual logic put into this. This isn't just pure marketing numbers, we promise. And we've actually calculated this based on some additional discounts for trading, etc. So there is some logic that's been put into these numbers in order to be able to work this out. So this is using what's called the autonomous cloud and the ultimate tier of it, which is what we would be using if we were using the autonomous migrate. And the autonomous cloud is effectively Ultima's automated management documentation platform for Azure. So this allows you to take advantage of everything that we've talked about, a load more stuff, and there is a load more information on autonomous cloud available on Ultima's website. So I would recommend that you look into that if that is something that you are interested in. But it allows you to go and kind of fully leverage the cloud in the same way that you would a kind of more traditional data center in some ways, and actually be able to get the full proper benefit out of it. So this should give you an idea in terms of what those costs look like. As you can see, there are the metrics. At the end of this presentation, all the slides will be sent out, so you will get a copy of this, so you can go and look at all these numbers, work it out. There will obviously be some slight changes for everyone's businesses, so power prices, staffing prices, all that kind of stuff, and cost of hardware, all those kind of good things will vary from business to business. And therefore, you can look at these numbers, see if this kind of thing makes sense for you, and actually work out that kind of going forwards. So, as I said, this is a high-level presentation. We won't going into any massive detail today. It's more to give you a taster of what the various offerings are, see if there's anything that particularly interests you. If there is something that interests you, I would highly recommend that you go and look into getting the more detailed follow-on webinars from this. Because as I said, this is going to be part of a series with multiple webinars as part of it, and that should give you a much better detail, a much deeper dive into what everything is. If you do have any questions, then feel free to reach out to inquiries@ultima.com or your account manager if you know who that is. And then from that, we should be able to get back to you with any more information about anything that you require. If you have any questions now, then feel free to ask them and I will try and answer them to the best of my ability, or we might end up taking it offline depending on obviously what that is. And yeah, thank you very much for your attendance and I hope you will have a very pleasant day. Thank you.